Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Ankner. I'm the director of the Charles F. Cummings New Jersey Information Center at the Newark Public Library. Welcome to our program today, New Jersey at War, the 75th anniversary of VE Day. We are commemorating the day that Germany surrendered to the Allies in 1945, marking the end of the war in Europe. To give this event a local spin, we have invited To give this event a local spin, we have invited two scholars who researched the contributions of New Jerseyans to the war effort in World War II. Before we get started, I just wanted to encourage you all to fill out your census forms. Filling out the census is one small but very important thing we can do right now to help our city and our communities. If you haven't done so yet, please go to my2020census.gov, fill out the brief questionnaire. The information you provide affects funding for healthcare, transportation, your local schools, and many other needs. Remember, my2020census.gov. It is safe, secure, and confidential. Well, now let's begin our program. Let me start by introducing our guests. Patricia Chappine is a professor at Stockton University and the author of New Jersey Women in World War II. Joseph G. Bilby is assistant curator at the National Guard Militia Museum of New Jersey. He has written or co-written several books of New Jersey history, including a book entitled New Jersey, A Military History. Patty and Joe, thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
The first part of our program will be a discussion between myself and our guests. Later, I will open up the discussion to other people in the Zoom room. If you have questions in the meantime, you can type them in the chat box. So I'd like to begin with you, Patty. Your book details many ways in which women contributed to the war effort as air wardens, in defense plants, in the separate female branches of the military, or just in maintaining a household in a time of rationing and shortages. What was the impetus for your book?
Well, I've been interested in World War II, and it's funny how, it kind of just evolved as I got older. But originally, because my grandfather was in World War II, and he never really talked about it, but he had this shoebox, and I remember he always warned me, don't get into it. The stuff is fragile. And, naturally, as soon as he left the house, that's all I did was go in and look at the medals and the money from Europe and the patches and things like that. So it was really early on that I got into it. And then just as I got older, I got really interested in history in general. And I just noticed that there wasn't a collection of World War II women from New Jersey specifically. And I mean, lucky for me, it wasn't that there wasn't information about it, just wasn't collected in a form that was readily accessible to the public. There was actually a ton of information, way more than I could put in the book. But so it was, I feel like there could be a lot more volumes of it, but just as a sampling, I tried to get a good sample of, throughout the state, the different regions, and then the different things that women were doing, like the USO and the Red Cross, and of course, all the military branches and things like that.
So how did you find the women you interviewed for the book?
Well, a lot of it was archival work. So I actually went to the different areas. Like there are a lot of historical societies that have archives that you go and look through in the traditional old-fashioned way, do a lot of legwork. But Rutgers University, for instance, has a great online archive that anybody can look through. The Library of Congress has video, they have sound recordings and things like that. And that's also available for anyone to look through. You can do that by region, by war, by gender. So a lot of it were things that were just kind of scattered all over the place. And then a lot of it was just luck. I would go to one of the airfields, let's say, and someone would ask me what I was doing, and they'd say, oh, why don't you go talk to so-and-so? She was in the USO. And so a lot of it was accidental as well. And I think I got the best interviews really from just, totally accident. So.
Okay. All right. You point out in your book that the absence of men in many families was a double-edged sword for women. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Well, so, I mean, and I think our traditional view of this was that, it was definitely something that was unique and it was an opportunity for some, but it was also very scary because it was just women were thrown into these jobs that they had been traditionally told that they were incapable of just because they were women. they had to basically fend for themselves. And so the world, pretty much a lot of the women in the archive describe it as the world was just turned upside down. So, you know, not only were they dealing with if they decided to go into the workforce or if they decided to go into the military, but just being at home with rationing and, you know, trying to figure out how they were going to survive with basically, if they were married, with half of their support system gone. And they were very ingenious with the things that they did, even trying to have a sense of normalcy. And I always think of the nylon shortages where the women didn't have stockings, and their solution to that was basically they painted them on so it looked like they had them. So just, you know, things like that, figuring out recipes and ways to deal with rationing. And along the shore, a lot of them talk about the dim out restrictions. And I know one woman I spoke to that was in the USO, she was from Millville, New Jersey. She actually just donated, within a couple of years, she donated her blackout curtains to the Millville Airfield, the Army Airfield Museum. And it was just something that people don't, if there's not a huge shoreline, like New Jersey has about 130 miles of shore. So it was just something very unique to shore communities that they were in dim out restrictions because the fear was that they could possibly be targeted because of the lights in the hotels and things like that. So they were in dim out restrictions for pretty much the duration. The speed limit was capped because there was a, you know, the fear that there was going to be a shortage of tires eventually. So it was just a very unique thing that they had to deal with.
Okay, all right. So you write about the Women's Army Corps, or WACs, and other military units in your book. World War II marked the first time that women formally joined the military, isn't that right?
Well, it was the first time that they significantly, in such great numbers, joined. So in the First World War, there was actually a lot of them, you know, there was about 13,000 that joined the Navy. There were Army and Navy nurses during the First World War. And a couple hundred of them actually joined the Marine Corps Reserve. So there were women in the First World War as well, but during World War II, it was, you know, the first time that significantly they joined. And, you know, they joined basically also, they were in the Coast Guard, they were in the Navy, the Army, the nursing, and they were also women Air Force service pilots, which technically weren't considered part of the Army at that point. They were civilians serving with the military, but it wasn't until later on that they were actually given benefits and recognition. But so the scale was not there. Also in the First World War, they had what they called Hello Girls. That was the nickname. And they were women that worked with the Signal Corps.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There was considerable opposition to women serving in the military, even from their own families. Wasn't that right?
Yeah, and there were some women that actually described their parents being very supportive. So it wasn't always the case, but it seemed like the majority of them did describe that there was opposition from, you know, their families. Some of the women actually described breaking up with significant others over the fight, whether, you know, they were going to join the military or not. So I find that kind of amusing that a lot of the women did say, well, you know, he said, if I joined the WAC, I wasn't going to be involved with him. And I said, okay. And they just they went on with it. A lot of them secretly joined. So yeah, there was opposition, and even from our own government. I like to talk about, you know, General Eisenhower actually was originally, he did not believe that women should join the military. By the end of the war, he was actually one of the biggest proponents, trying to encourage them to be active and, you know, not just part of an emergency, but part of the regular reserves. So, you know, just through his observation of the way they conducted themselves, he was basically swayed. So yeah, but a lot of them did face opposition with whatever they tried to do, not just the military, the baseball players, the women that worked in the defense industry. So
yeah.
A lot of them ignored it, thankfully.
Yeah. Eisenhower had a female driver too for war, which was unusual. So you devote a chapter to African-American women in the war effort. What kind of special challenges did Black women face during the war?
So, well, I mean, they faced a war on several fronts when you think about it. So not only were they helping with our war effort, with the war effort between the, Axis and Allies, but they were also dealing with, a war based on their gender, they were discriminated against, based on their race, they were discriminated against. And since segregation was still, until the 1960s, segregation was still something that we had in this country. They actually, when they were in the military, even in the USO, they were segregated. So they faced discrimination, and it didn't let up because they were involved in the war effort at all. So the hope was that with the Double Victory campaign, that they would actually be subject to less discrimination, that once we defeated fascism, overseas, that hopefully that would occur here. Sadly, it took a lot longer, but yeah, so a lot of the things that they don't realize, that the USO was segregated, and a lot of the different, like the Women's Army Corps, they were one of the first branches to actually accept African American women, and they had about 6,500. So it was a pretty big, even though it was a small percentage, they had the most out of any of the military branches that accepted women during World War II.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. Okay. So Joe, written extensively about New Jersey service members in all of America's wars. One of them is John Basilone, who served in World War II. Can you tell us his story?
Yeah, John Basilone was, he was one of the main characters in the HBO series, the Pacific, and he was from Raritan, New Jersey, and he had served in the Army in the 1930s, and when the war began, he joins the Marine Corps. And in Guadalcanal, he wins the Medal of Honor because he holds off a whole Japanese assault when he's down to just his pistol. So they bring him back to the United States, and then he goes on a war bond sales tour, and he doesn't have to go back to the battle. And after a while, though, he feels guilty, and he again requests that he go back and become a combat soldier again, and he does, and unfortunately, he's killed on Iwo Jima. Okay. He is probably the best known New Jersey war veteran.
Yeah, a lot of people have heard of him. You've also written about a history that is largely forgotten today, the presence of German submarines off the coast of New Jersey during World War II. Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, it's kind of complicated because the British tell us originally that they've broken the code and German submarines are coming for the coast right after the war starts in December 41. And the Navy more or less ignores it, except for the naval commander in New York who says, hey, I need help. And then they begin to sink ships, about a dozen between January and say late July. And finally the Navy gets its act together. But then there's a feud between the Navy and the state, where the Navy blames the state for having lights on, and the reflections can be used by the Germans to see ships and sink them. And then the governor, Governor Edison, sends a mission with the state police and civil defense chair down the coast, and they say, well, we haven't seen anything. Asbury Park's completely blacked out. A little bit of light from Atlantic City, but then we get down and the biggest lights of all, lit up like a Christmas tree, the Navy base in Cape May. So they continue to argue back and forth, but by the end of the summer, they have inshore convoys, which they hadn't had before, and then they have the Germans call off the subs and tell them just to try to sink convoys going to Europe. Originally, they were supposed to intercept and shoot down oil tankers, and the first one goes down in late January of 1941.
So there was an incident in which an American ship was sunk off New Jersey by a German submarine in 1942. How did New Jerseyans of the day react to the sinking?
Well, in World War I, there was a submarine off the coast as well, and it was a tourist attraction in Asbury Park because they were looking for it with planes and ships, and all the tourists ran down to the boardwalk to watch the thing. But in World War II, it was quite scary. And they actually sank the Jacob Jones, a Navy destroyer, off of Cape May. And most of these were fairly out at sea, but still, you know, then there was the dim out, as was mentioned. Then there was the blackout of inshore stuff, and it was, people were scared. But by 1943, you could go to the beach again.
Oh, okay. That's good. So you were assistant curator at the National Guard Militia Museum of New Jersey now.
Correct.
The museum is a repository for an ambitious oral history project. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, that's run by my colleague, Carol Fowler, and she has over 600 interviews. And she works in conjunction with the Library of Congress. And we have a lot of them interviews posted at our website, including some with women. We have some very interesting, because he started around 2004 with the interviews, and there were still a lot of World War II vets around.
Yeah.
Not so much anymore. And that's how I got down there, because I was retired, and she wanted to interview me for my Vietnam service. But I wholly recommend that historians check out our website.
Yeah, I looked at that site. It's interesting. Yeah, yeah. So you, as you mentioned, you were a veteran of the war in Vietnam. That experience, I'm guessing, really influences your interest in military history. Is there any way in which it has colored your research on World War II?
Well, I looked at, I was a lieutenant in Vietnam, and I was there a few months, and I looked at everything around me in 1966, and I said, well, this isn't going to end well, because I was a history major in college, and I just knew how these things go. World War II is a whole different thing. My father was in World War II. World War II was a necessity. It had to be done. And I think most people felt that way. In World War I, there was a big propaganda offensive. And World War II was a different kind of propaganda offensive. It was all, we're in this together, we have to win. World War I, it was the Germans just around the corner listening to you. And it promoted ethnic, shall we say, distress. And World War II, it was more, we're in this together. And that's where I was always optimistic. I mean, my father told me stories, and I read the history, and it's an entirely different thing than Vietnam.
Okay. So you've written a book about African-American soldiers from New Jersey during the Civil War.
Yeah.
Do you have any information about New Jersey's African-Americans who served in World War II?
That's interesting, because the Army, of course, was segregated long before World War II. And in 1930, a bunch of black veterans from New Jersey wanted to make up a National Guard unit, and they petitioned the state, and the state said, okay. They petitioned the federal government, and the federal government said, no, we're not going to do that, because certain Southern senators, that there were a few black National Guard units, most notably the one in New York, but they said, no. So the state went around, the state said, well, we'll create a militia unit. And so they did. And that unit was denied National Guard status, but was also, they were involved in the rescue of people from the Morro Castle disaster and other things. And then when they came up to 1941, and the federal government said, oh yeah, we will take you in the National Guard. Yeah, because they knew it was coming, And they were used as a battalion of with troops from Ohio, I believe, in New York, and they served during the war. A lot of the guys left that unit, went to other units, and were all over the world. But in World War I, it was funny because the black combat troops were excellent, and the unit from New York was in more combat than any other U.S. regiment, and they served with the French Army. And then after the war, there were a lot of lynchings in the South when veterans came home and said, hey, I went abroad, I fought for this country, I want my rights as a citizen. And there was a lot of civil disturbance.
Okay. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about VE Day since we're marking VE Day. Patty, do you have any stories about VE Day and the women profiled in your book?
Well, a lot of them in particular describe, just celebrations. So, the obvious one being in New York City, Times Square, you've got the famous historical photographs of that. But a lot of them say just, people were coming out in their hometowns and the neighbors would come out and congratulate each other. And there was a spirit of community. But on the flip side, a lot of the women that worked in the defense industry describe their last days occurring after, the VE Day celebration. So a lot of them were fired without much notice because the demand for, product wasn't there any longer. So it was kind of like a bittersweet thing where they were, obviously excited that it was coming to a close, even though, the Pacific Theater was still active, but that there was an end in sight and a return to normalcy in sight. But they were also, used to making these salaries that they had never made before, and a lot of them weren't even allowed back into the factories. So it was kind of, a lot of them describe actually not being allowed in and just being told to go see whatever office in particular their job had about severance pay and things like that. So they were quickly let go after the production wasn't necessary any longer.
Okay. Wow. So, Joe, you grew up in Newark. I know you're not old enough to remember VE Day in Newark, but did you hear any stories from your family about that day?
Well, I actually was about a year and a half old. Needless to say, I do not remember. I looked through the newspapers and I talked to my parents, and it was kind of low key with them because my father was still in Europe, and his unit was told they were going to return to the United States, and they would be part of the second wave of the invasion of Japan. And that fact that the war was still going on, and that the invasion of Japan was predicted 1 million casualties because they were so fanatical in defending the country, that I think people said, and a lot of the newspapers that I've read, they had a little religious ceremony. People came out and shook hands, but it was lower key than say the one in New York. And that they were just thinking, well, it's half done, so we go to the next one.
Yeah, it only lasted months. So I'm going to open this up to other questions. Domenick Stampone, you have a question. Do you want me to unmute you? You can ask it verbally. I'm trying to unmute you, but it's not letting me. There you go. You want to ask your question? You had to ask the question in the chat box.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Good afternoon. Thank you again for hosting this to the Newark Library. It's a welcome break from everything else.
Glad you like it.
My question has to do with POWs that were housed here in New Jersey.
Yeah.
I had, growing up in New Jersey, I would hear stories about such camps, didn't know much about them. And then at some point, I did learn about them. What happened to those POWs once VE Day came along? I have to assume that they were repatriated, but were there circumstances where any stayed? And if so, what would be those the reasons that they would be permitted to stay?
Do you have an answer to that?
I am not aware of being permitted to stay. I think they were repatriated. Some of them then came back here as immigrants after the war. I know that. But there were quite a few in New Jersey. They worked at farms. And after Italy dropped out of the war, the Italians were given a good deal of freedom. And matter of fact, my father, one of his best friends in the Army was an Italian-American guy who spoke Italian. And they were getting ready to go over, and they were in Camp Kilmer in a men's room, I guess. And he heard these guys speaking Italian, and this guy went nuts and started yelling at them. My father had to drag him out. So what do you mean? He said, well, we're going over to fight the Germans, and those guys are going on dates. So I don't know what they really mean.
There were also Japanese Americans interned in South Jersey, right?
It's a racist story. There were Japanese Americans who were put on a farm up in, I believe it was Morris County, or maybe Somerset. And there were 5 or 6 of them, and there were threats about going after them with a shotgun, and they said, Japs get out, and all this. So there was a racial thing there. Whereas the Germans, you know, and the Italians, that wasn't that kind of a prejudice. And the Germans were at Fort Dix, you know, very few tried to escape. I mean, they were cooking their own meals. They put on shows. Yeah, I have a photograph of a musical show put on by the German POWs at Fort Dix.
Okay. Are there any other questions for anyone? Any other participants? Anybody have any questions? Just either raise your hand or, you know, let me know and I can unmute you. Okay, it looks like we don't have any other questions. Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Let's see. Well, thank you, Joe and Patty, for joining us today. I'm just getting back to my script. And thank you to everyone else who participated in our program. Please join us next week for more programs. On Monday, I will be leading one of our NPL at home sessions, focusing on the Berg photo collection. Dr. Samuel Berg traveled around Newark during the early 1960s, taking photos of houses, churches, theaters, shops, and other structures that were demolished a few years later for urban renewal. That's Monday at 1 o'clock on Zoom. Next Thursday, I sit down with 2 genealogists to discuss how they use census information in their work. That's Thursday at 1 o'clock on Zoom. For information about these and other programs, check the calendar on the Newark Public Library website, npl.org. Stay safe, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Patty. Thank you, Joe. This was great.
Much.
I hope you liked it.
Take care.
Yeah, you too. Okay, stop. Oh, end the meeting.